Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. Chapter 12. What it said on the golden ticket. Charlie burst through the front door, shouting, "Mother! Mother! Mother!" Mrs. Bucket was in the old grandparents' room serving them their evening soup. "Mother!" yelled Charlie, rushing in on them like a hurricane. "Look! I got it, Mother! Look, Mother, look! The last golden ticket is mine! I found some money in the street and I bought 2 candy bars. And the second one had the golden ticket. And there were crowds of people all around me wanting to see it. And the shopkeeper rescued me and I ran all the way home and here I am. It's the 5th golden ticket, Mother! I found it!" Mrs. Bucket simply stared, while the 4 old grandparents who were sitting in the bed balancing bowls of soup on their laps all dropped their spoons with the clatter and froze against their pillows. For about 10 seconds there was absolute silence in the room. Nobody dared to speak or move. It was a magical moment. Then very softly Grandpa Joe said, "You're pulling our legs, Charlie, aren't you? You're just having a little joke." "I am not!" cried Charlie, rushing up to the bed, holding out the large and beautiful golden ticket for him to see. Grandpa Joe leaned forward and took a close look, his nose almost touching the ticket. The others watched him, waiting for the verdict. Then very slowly, with a slow and marvelous grin spreading all over his face, Grandpa Joe lifted his head and looked straight at Charlie, the color rushing to his cheeks and his eyes were wide open, shining with joy, and in the center of each eye, right in the very center, in the black pupil, a little spark of wild excitement was slowly dancing. Then the old man took a deep breath and suddenly, with no warning whatsoever, an explosion seemed to take place inside him. He threw up his arms and yelled, "Yippee!" And at the same time, his long bony body rose up out of the bed. His bowl of soup went flying into the face of Grandma Josephine, and in one fantastic leap, this old fellow of 96 and a half, who hadn't been out of bed in the last 20 years, jumped onto the floor and started doing a victory dance in his pajamas. "Yippee! 3 cheers for Charlie! Hip, hip, hooray!" At this point, the door opened and Mr. Bucket walked into the room. He was cold and tired, and he looked it. All day long he had been shoveling snow in the streets. "Cripes," he cried. "What's going on in here?" It didn't take them long to tell him what had happened. I don't believe it. It's not possible." "Show him the ticket, Charlie," shouted Grandpa Joe, who was still dancing around the floor like a dervish in his striped pajamas. "Show your father the 5th and the last golden ticket in the world." "Let me see it, Charlie," Mr. Bucket said, collapsing into a chair and holding out his hand. Charlie came forward with the precious document. It was a beautiful thing, this golden ticket, having been made so it seemed from a sheet of pure gold, hammered out to the thinness of paper. On one side of it, printed by some clever method in jet black letters, was the invitation itself from Mr. Wonka. "Read it aloud. Let's hear what it says," said Grandpa Joe, climbing back into bed once more. Mr. Bucket held the lovely golden ticket up close to his eyes. His hands were trembling slightly, and he seemed to be overcome by the whole business. He took several deep breaths, and he cleared his throat and said, All right, I'll read it. Here we go. "Greetings to you, the lucky finder of this ticket from Mr. Willy Wonka. I shake you warmly by the hand. Tremendous things are in store for you. Many wonderful surprises await. For now, I do invite you to come to my factory and be my guest for 1 whole day. You and all the others who are lucky enough to find my golden tickets. I, Willy Wonka, will conduct you around the factory myself, showing you everything that there is to see. And afterwards, when it is time for you to leave, you will be escorted home by a procession of large trucks. These trucks, I can promise you, will be loaded with enough delicious eatables to last you and your entire household for many years. and if at any time thereafter you should run out of supplies, you only have to come back to the factory, show this golden ticket, and I shall be happy to refill your cupboard with whatever you want. In this way, you will be able to keep yourself supplied with tasty morsels for the rest of your life. But this by no means is the most exciting thing that will happen on the day of your visit. I am preparing other surprises that are even more marvelous and more fantastic for you and for all my beloved golden ticket holders. Mystic and marvelous surprises that will entrance, delight, intrigue, astonish, and perplex you beyond measure. In your wildest dreams, you could not imagine that such things could happen to you. Just wait and see. And now, here are your instructions. The day I have chosen for the visit is the first day in the month of February. On this day, and on no other, you must come to the factory gates at 10 o'clock sharp in the morning. Don't be late, and you are allowed to bring with you either 1 or 2 members of your own family to look after you and to assure that you don't get into any mischief. One more thing. Be certain to have this ticket with you, otherwise you will not be admitted. Signed, Mr. Willy Wonka. The first day of February, cried Mrs. Bucket. But that's tomorrow. Today's the last day of January, I know it is. Gripes, I think you're right, said Mr. Bucket. You're just in time, shouted Grandpa Joe. There's not a moment to lose. You must start making preparations at once. Wash your face, comb your hair, scrub your hands, brush your teeth, blow your nose, cut your nails, polish your shoes, iron your shirt, and for heaven's sake, get all that mud off your pants. You really must be getting ready, my boy. You must get ready for the biggest day of your life. Now, don't overexcite yourself, Grandpa, said Mrs. Bucket, and don't fluster poor Charlie. We must all try to keep very calm. Now, the first thing to decide is this. Who's going to go with Charlie to the factory? I will! Shouted Grandpa Joe, leaping out of bed once again. I'll look after him. You leave it to me. Mrs. Bucket smiled at the old man, then she turned to her husband and said, How about you, dear? Don't you think you ought to go? Well, said Mr. Bucket, pausing to think about it. No, I'm not so sure that I should. But you must. There's no must about it, my dear, Mr. Bucket said gently. Mind you, I'd love to go. It'll be tremendously exciting. But on the other hand, I believe that the person who really deserves to go most of all is Grandpa Joe himself. He seems to know more about it than we do, provided, of course, that he feels well enough to. Yippee! Shouted Grandpa Joe, seizing Charlie by the hands and dancing around the room. He certainly seems well enough, Mrs. Bucket said, laughing. Yes, perhaps you're right, after all. Perhaps Grandpa Joe should be the one to go with him. I certainly can't go in myself and leave the other 3 old people all alone in bed for the whole day. Hallelujah! Praise the Lord! At this point, there came a loud knock on the front door. Mr. Bucket went to open, and the next moment, swarms of newspapermen and photographers were pouring into the house. They had tracked down the finder of the golden ticket, and now they all wanted to get the full story for the front pages of morning papers. For several hours there was a complete pandemonium in the little house, and it must have been nearly midnight before Mr. Bucket was able to finally get rid of them, so that Charlie could go to bed. Chapter 13. The big day arrives. The sun was shining brightly on the morning of the big day, but the ground was still white with snow, and the air was very cold. Outside the gates of Wonka's factory, enormous crowds of people gathered to watch the 5 lucky ticket holders go in. Excitement was tremendous. It was just before 10 o'clock. The crowds were pushing and shouting, and policemen with arms linked were trying to hold them back from the gates. Right behind the gates, in a small group that was carefully shielded from the crowds by the police, stood the 5 famous children, together with the grown-ups who had come with them. The tall, bony old figure of Grandpa Joe could be seen standing quietly among them, and beside him, holding tightly onto his hand, was little Charlie Bucket himself. All the children except Charlie had both their mothers and fathers with them, and it was a good thing that they had, otherwise the whole party might have gotten out of hand. They were so eager to get going that their parents were having to hold them back by force to prevent them from climbing over the gates. Be patient, cried the father. Be still, it's not time yet. It's not 10 o'clock. Behind him, Charlie Bucket could hear the shouts of people in the crowd as they pushed and fought to get a glimpse of the famous children. That's Violet Bogart. That's her, all right. I can remember her face from the newspapers. And you know what? She's still chewing that dreadful piece of gum she's had for 3 months. Look at her jaws. They're still working on it. Who's that big fat boy? That's Augustus Gloop. So it is. Enormous, isn't he? Fantastic! Who's the kid with the picture of the Lone Ranger stenciled on his windbreaker? That's Mac TV. He's the television fiend. I must be crazy. Look at all those crazy pistols he's got hanging all over him. The one I want to see is Veruca Salt, shouted another voice in the crowd. She's the girl whose father bought 500,000 candy bars and they made the workers in his peanut factory unwrap every one of them until they found a golden ticket. He gives her anything she wants, absolutely anything. All she has to do is start screaming and she gets it. Dreadful, isn't it? Shocking, I call it. Which do you think is her? That one, over there on the left. The girl in the silver mink coat. Which one is Charlie Bucket? Charlie Bucket? Oh, he must be that skinny little shrimp standing beside the fellow who looks like a skeleton. Right close to us, just there. You see him? Why hasn't he got a coat on in this cold weather? Don't ask me. Maybe he can't afford to buy one. Jeepers. He must be freezing. Charlie, standing only a few paces from the speaker, gave Grandpa Joe's hand a squeeze, and the old man looked down at Charlie and smiled. Somewhere in the distance, a church clock began to strike 10. Very slowly, with a loud creaking of rusty hinges, the great iron gates of the factory began to swing open. The crowd became suddenly silent. The children stopped jumping about. All eyes were fixed upon the gate. There he is! Somebody shouted. That's him! And so it was. Chapter 14. Mr. Willy Wonka. Mr. Wonka was standing all alone just inside the open gates of the factory. And what an extraordinary little man he was. He had a black top hat on his head. He wore a tailcoat made of beautiful plum-colored velvet. His trousers were bottle green. His gloves were pearly gray, and in one hand he carried a fine gold-top walking cane. Covering his chin, there was a small, neat, pointed black beard, a goatee. And his eyes were most marvelously bright. They seemed to be sparkling and twinkling at you all the time. The whole face, in fact, was alight with fun and laughter. And oh, how clever he looked. How quick and sharp and full of life. He kept making quick, jerky little movements with his head, cocking his head this way and that, taking everything in with those white, bright, twinkling eyes. He was like a squirrel in the quickness of his movements, a quick, clever old squirrel in the park. Suddenly he did a funny little skipping dance in the snow. He spread his arms wide and he smiled at the 5 children who were clustered near the gates, and he called out, "Welcome, my little friends! Welcome to the factory!" His voice was high and fluttery. "Will you come forward one at a time, please?" he called out. "And bring your parents. Then show me your golden ticket and give me your name. Who's first?" The fat boy stepped up. "I'm Augustus Gloop," he says. "Augustus!" cried Augustus! cried Mr. Wonka, seizing his hand and pumping it up and down with terrible force. "My dear boy, how good to see you. Delighted, charmed, overjoyed to have you with us. And are these your parents?" "How nice! Come in, come in, come in. That's right, step through these gates." Mr. Wonka was clearly just as excited as everybody else. "My name is Veruca Salt. My dear Veruca, how do you do? What a pleasure this is. You do have an interesting name, don't you? I always thought that a verruca was a sort of wart that you got on the sole of your foot. But I must be wrong, mustn't I? How pretty you look in that lovely mink coat. I'm so glad you could come. Dear me, this is going to be such an exciting day. I do hope you enjoy it. I'm sure you will. I know you will. Your father, how are you, Mr. Salt and Mrs. Salt? Overjoyed to see you. Yes, the ticket is quite in order. Please go in. The next two children, Violet Beauregard and Mike TV, came forward to have their tickets examined, and then to have their arms practically pumped off their shoulders by the energetic Mr. Wonka. And at last, a small nervous voice whispered, "Charlie Bucket." "Charlie!" cried Mr. Wonka. "Well, well, well!" So there you are. You're the one who found your ticket only yesterday, aren't you? Yes, yes. I read all about it this morning's papers. Just in time, my dear boy. I'm so glad. So happy for you. And this your grandfather? Delighted to meet you, sir. Overjoyed, enraptured, enchanted. All right, excellent. Is everybody in now? 5 children? Yes? Good. Now will you please follow me? Our tour is about to begin, but do keep together. Please don't wander off by yourselves. I shouldn't like to lose any of you at this stage of the proceedings. Oh dear me, no. Charlie glanced back over his shoulder and saw the great iron entrance gates closing slowly behind him. The crowds on the outside were still pushing and shouting. Charlie took one last look at them. Then as the gates closed with a clang, all sight of Wonka outside world disappeared. "Here we are!" cried Mr. Wonka, trotting along in front of the group. "Through this big red door, please. That's right. It's nice and warm inside. I have to keep it warm inside the factory because of the workers. My workers are used to an extremely hot climate. They can't stand the cold. They'd perish if they went outdoors in this weather. They'd freeze to death." "But who are these workers?" asked Augustus Gloop. "All in good time, my dear boy," said Mr. Wonka, smiling at Augustus. "Be patient. You shall see everything as we go along. Are all of you inside? Good. Would you mind closing the door? Thank you." Charlie Bucket found himself standing in a long corridor that stretched in front of him, as far as he could see. The corridor was so wide that a car could have easily been driven along it. The walls were pale pink, the lighting soft and pleasant. "How lovely and warm," whispered Charlie. "I know, and what a marvelous smell," answered Grandpa Joe, taking a long, deep whiff. All the most wonderful smells in the world seemed to be mixing in the air around them. The smell of roasting coffee, burnt sugar, melting chocolate, mint and violets, crushed hazelnuts and apple blossom and caramel and lemon peel. And far away in the distance, from the heart of the great factory, came a giant muffled roar of energy, as though some monstrous, gigantic machine were spinning its wheels at breakneck speed. "Now this, my dear children," said Mr. Wonka, raising his voice above the noise, "is the main corridor. Will you please hang your coats and hats on the pegs over here and then follow me? That's the way. Good, good. Everyone ready? Everyone ready? Come on, here we go." He trotted off rapidly down the corridor with the tails of his plum-colored velvet cloak flapping behind him, and all the visitors hurried after. It was quite a large party of people when you came to think of it. There were 9 grown-ups and 5 children, 14 in all. So you can imagine that there was a good deal of pushing and shoving as they hustled and bustled down the passage, trying to keep up with the swift little figure moving in front of them. "Come on, get a move on, please. We'll never get around it today if you dawdle like that." Soon he turned right off the main corridor into another slightly narrower passage, and then he turned left, and then he turned right. Then he turned left again, then left, then right, then right, then left. The place was a gigantic rabbit warren. He turned right again. The passages were sloping steeper and steeper downward now. And then suddenly, Mr. Wonka stopped in front of him. There was this shiny metal door. The party crowded around. On the door in large letters, it said, "The Chocolate Room." Chapter 15, The Chocolate Room. "An important room, this!" cried Mr. Wonka, taking a bunch of keys from his pockets and slipping one into the keyhole of the door. "This is the nerve center of the whole factory, the whole heart of the business, and so beautiful. I insist upon my rooms being beautiful. I can't abide ugliness in factories. In we go then, but do be careful, my dear children. Don't lose your heads. Don't get overexcited. Keep very calm." Mr. Wonka opened the door. 5 children and 9 grown-ups pushed their ways in, and oh, what an amazing sight it was that now met their eyes. They were looking down upon a lovely valley. There were green meadows on either side of the valley, and along the bottom of it flowed a great brown river. What is more, there is a tremendous waterfall halfway along the river, a steep cliff over which the water curled and rolled in a solid sheet, and then went crashing down into a boiling, churning whirlpool of froth and spray. Below the waterfall, and this was the most astounding sight of all, a whole mass of enormous glass pipes were dangling down into the river from somewhere high up in the ceiling. They were really enormous, those pipes. They must have been about a dozen of them at least, and they were sucking up the brownish mud from the river and carrying it away to goodness knows where. And because they were made of glass, you could see the liquid flowing and bubbling along inside them, and above the noise of the waterfall you could hear the never-ending sucking sound of the pipes as they did their work. Graceful trees and bushes were growing along the riverbanks, weeping willows and alders and tall clumps of rhododendrons and their pink and red mauve blossoms. In the meadows there were thousands of buttercups. "There!" cried Mr. Wonka, dancing up and down, pointing his gold-topped cane at the great brown river. "It's all chocolate! Every drop of that river is hot, melted chocolate of the finest quality. The very finest quality. There's enough chocolate in there to fill every bathtub in the entire country. And all the swimming pools as well. Isn't it terrific? Just look at my pipes. They suck up the chocolate and carry it away to the other rooms in the factory where it's needed. Thousands of gallons an hour, my dear children. Thousands and thousands of gallons." The children and their parents were too flabbergasted to speak. They were staggered, they were dumbfounded, they were bewildered and dazzled. They were completely bowled over by the hugeness of the whole thing. They simply stared. "The waterfall is most important. It mixes up the chocolate. It churns it up. It pounds it, and it beats it, and it makes it light and frothy. No other factory in the world mixes its chocolate by waterfall, but it's the only way to do it properly, the only way. And do you like my trees, my lovely bushes? Don't you think they look pretty? I told you I hate ugliness. And of course, they're all eatable. All made of something different and delicious. And do you like my meadows? Do you like my grass and my buttercups? The grass you're standing on, my dear little ones, is made of a new, soft, minty sugar that I've just invented. I call it Swudge. Try a blade, please do. It's delectable." Automatically, everybody bent down and picked one blade of grass. Everybody, that is, except Augustus Gloop, who took a big handful. And Violet Beauregard, before tasting a blade of grass, took a piece of the world record-breaking chewing gum out of her mouth and stuck it carefully behind her ear. Isn't it wonderful?" whispered Charlie. "Hasn't it got a wonderful taste, Grandpa?" "I could eat a whole field. I could go around on all fours like a cow and eat every blade of grass in this field, said Grandpa Joe, grinning with delight. Try a buttercup. They're even nicer, cried Mr. Wonka. And suddenly the air was filled with screams of excitement. The screams came from Veruca Salt. She was pointing frantically over to the other side of the river. Look! Look over there! What is it? He's moving and he's walking. It's like a little person. It's a little man. Down there, below the waterfall. Everybody stopped picking buttercups and stared across the river. She's right, Grandpa. It is a little man. Can you see him? I see him, Charlie. And now everybody started shouting at once, There's 2 of them! My gosh, so there is. There's more than 2. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. What are they doing? Where do they come from? Who are they? Children and parents alike rushed down to the edge of the river to get a closer look. Aren't they fantastic? No higher than my knee. Look at that funny long hair, Daddy. The tiny men, they were no larger than medium-sized dolls, had stopped what they were doing now, and they were staring back across the river at the visitors. One of them pointed towards the children, and then he whispered something to the other 4, and all 5 of them burst into peals of laughter. But they can't be real people, Charlie said. Of course they're real people, Mr. Wonka answered. They're Oompa Loompas. Chapter 16. Oompa Loompas. Oompa Loompas? Oompa Loompas? Everyone said at once. Imported direct from Loopaland, said Mr. Wonka proudly. There's no such place, said Mrs. Salt. Excuse me, dear lady, but Mr. Wonka, I am a teacher of geography. Then you'll know all about it, and what a terrible country it is. Nothing but thick jungles infested with the most dangerous beasts in the entire world. Hornswogglers, snozzwingers, and those terrible, wicked wang-doodles. A wang-doodle could eat 10 Oompa Loompas for breakfast and come galloping back for a second helping. When I went there, I found the little Oompa Loompas living in tree houses. They had to live in the tree houses to escape from the wang-doodles and the hornswogglers and the snozzwingers, and they were practically starving to death. They were living on green caterpillars, and the caterpillars tasted revolting. And the Oompa Loompas spent every moment of the days climbing through the treetops, looking for things to smash up with the caterpillars to make them taste better. Red beetles, for instance, eucalyptus leaves, and the bark of the bong-bong tree. All of them beastly, but not quite so beastly as the caterpillars. Poor little Oompa Loompas. The one food that they longed for more than anything was the cacao bean. The one food that they longed for more than anything was the cacao bean, but they couldn't get it. An Oompa Loompa was lucky if he found 3 or 4 cacao beans a year. But oh, how they craved them. They used to dream about cacao beans all night and talk about them all day. You only had to mention the word cacao to an Oompa Loompa and he would start dribbling at the mouth. The cacao bean, Mr. Wonka continued, which grows on the cacao tree, happens to be the thing from which all chocolate is made. You cannot make chocolate without the cacao bean, and the cacao bean is chocolate. I myself use billions of cacao beans every week in this factory, and so, my dear children, as soon as I discovered that the Oompa Loompas were crazy for this particular food, I climbed up to the treehouse village and poked my head in through the door of the treehouse belonging to the leader of the tribe. The poor little fellow looked thin and starved, and was sitting there trying to eat a bowl full of mashed up green caterpillars without being sick. Look here, I said, speaking not in English, of course, but in Oompa Loompa-ish. Look here, if you and all your people want to come back to my country and live in my factory, You can have all the cacao beans you want. I have mountains of them in storehouses. You can have cacao beans for every meal. You can gorge yourself silly on them. I'll even pay your wages in cacao beans if you wish. You really mean it? Said the Oompa Loompas leader, leaping up from a chair. Of course I mean it, I said. And you can have the chocolate as well. Chocolate tastes even better than the cacao beans because it's got milk and sugar added. The little man gave a great whoop of joy and threw his mashed ball of caterpillars right out of the treehouse window. It's a deal, he said. Come on, let's go. So I shipped them all over here, every man, woman, and child in the Oompa Loompa tribe. It was easy. I smuggled them over in large packing crates with holes in them, and they all got here safely. They are truly wonderful workers. They all speak English now. They love dancing and music. They're always making up songs. I expect you'll hear a good deal of singing today from time to time. I must warn you, though, that they are rather mischievous. They like jokes. They still wear the same kind of clothes they wore in the jungle. They insist upon that. The men, as you can see for yourselves across the river, wear only deer skins. The women wear leaves, and the children wear nothing at all. The women use fresh leaves every day. Daddy! Shouted Veruca Salt, the girl who got everything she wanted. Daddy, I want an Oompa Loompa. I want you to get me an Oompa Loompa. I want an Oompa Loompa right away. I want to take it home with me. Go on, Daddy. Get me an Oompa Loompa. No, no, my pet. We mustn't interrupt Mr. Wonka. But I want an Oompa Loompa! Screamed Veruca. All right, Veruca, all right. But I can't get it for you this second. Please be patient. I'll see you have one before the day is out. Augustus, shouted Mrs. Gloop. Augustus, sweetheart. I don't think you should be doing that. Augustus Gloop, as you may have guessed, had quietly sneaked off down the edge of the river, and he was now kneeling on the river bank, scooping hot melted chocolate into his mouth as fast as he could. And I think that's where we're going to stop reads for today. We just finished chapters, I believe, 13 through 16.